Hello, everyone. It is week 4 for you guys, and I'm going to do a couple of lectures for this week in regards to what we're covering. So, just a couple of things. The readings for this week, of course, are found on the course outline in regards to the American Yap readings and then the first-hand readings. Then I would like you to watch Liberty, Part 6, which is I think the best of the episodes. It is dealing with the end of the revolution and the coming of the Constitution. It gives a really nice, quick overview of how the Constitution came about, what the reasoning for was it, and they speak to a lot of very big, important figures and historians who have been studying this for decades. The other is I want you to watch more for the second half of the week, the We Shall Remain, Trail of Tears, dealing with the making of the United States in the post-revolutionary, post-Constitution era. This era of the early decades was a time period in which Native Americans and the new nation were often coming into conflict, hitting its high point in the pre-Civil War era in the notorious Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of Andrew Johnson. Next week, what we're going to be dealing with is you're going to have your midterm that is due. It will be due on that same Sunday of week 5. It will be a couple of questions. You will answer one of the questions in a short 5-paragraph essay. You can use your book, use your notes, all these lectures, absolutely. And we'll also start to deal with 19th century American society and culture, leading to, not surprisingly, the breakdown of that society and culture with the Civil War as this event coming 80 years or so after the founding of the nation. So in regards to the Constitution and the episode of Liberty that hopefully you have watched or about to watch, I think one of the most interesting aspects of dealing with the Constitution is twofold. One is to think of how we look at the Constitution today. Most Americans and most politicians, most figures, view the Constitution as this incredibly important, obviously, document that is in some ways perhaps we view it as being a bit too perfect than what it really is. Most of the founders understood that the Constitution was going to be a working document, but what founders perhaps couldn't have foreseen quite as much was how we, over the last 200 odd years, have fought over the meaning of the Constitution, all the different ways to interpret the Constitution, sometimes utilizing the Constitution for what we would see as being really regressive ends in terms of the era of race specifically, and sometimes understanding it in more progressive ways to kind of see what the future of the country could hold. That video does, again, a really great job of giving a sense of the post-revolutionary era, the Articles of Confederation, and then the founding of the formation of the Constitution, with the driving force of course, James Madison behind it, the important Federalist Papers of Hamilton Jay and Madison that for many Americans is really the epitome of American political philosophy, and still are referenced all the time today. And then, of course, I think the most interesting aspect of that video is they do a very good job of giving the sense that the people in America in 1787, 88, 89 were not agreed upon the Constitution. There were many who viewed it with, at the very least, distrust, and for some, distaste. Many saw the Constitution, in fact, as a method of recreating the British government of aristocracy, monarchy, and democracy mixed together, and they felt that this was going against the democratic, independent nature of the Revolutionary War that had taken place a couple of years before. But nonetheless, of course, the Constitution was accepted. It became the law of the land for most of those colonies turned into states from that point on. The one thing I do want to mention in regards to the Constitution that I really don't think the video does a great job of dealing with, and that is the discussion of the Bill of Rights. So, of course, the Bill of Rights are the 10 amendments, initial amendments after the the Constitution was passed. It's seen oftentimes as being the thing that allowed the Constitution to pass. It was promised that this would be the first thing that the new government would do, would be to pass these Bill of Rights. Now, one of the things that's surprising about this is that people who were against putting the Bill of Rights in, their argument wasn't that we didn't need a Bill of Rights. They just simply said that a Bill of Rights was sometimes implied, or the Bill of Rights would be protected by states. This points to the fact that oftentimes, in terms of still at this early point where the Constitution was supposed to strengthen the federal government, there was still a sense that the states were going to be extremely important in regards to protecting people's rights and having a say in terms of the lives of people. Obviously, what we have seen over the last 200 some years is, in many ways, even though of course this is still an argument, how much right or how much power are states going to have versus the federal government, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, there's no doubting that in the 20th century the federal government has become incredibly important and powerful, and oftentimes has kind of overawed the power of the states. We will see one of the things that has been misunderstood in regards to the future of American politics after the Constitution is this idea that conservatives were always arguing for states' rights against a powerful federal government. In fact, what we will see as we move towards the Civil War is that what we see actually in many ways today. It depends on what the topic is. So for instance, to give a sense of this, we will see that one of the arguments that has been the center of explaining why the Civil War beyond slavery it happened in the United States was this notion that the South was very concerned about their quote-unquote states' rights against national government overarching onto their rights and liberties. But in fact, what many historians would argue today is that in many ways the South, even though they would speak in that language, and on certain things they were concerned about the national government taking over quote-unquote their property, which of course meant humans, what they were also willing to do was to use the federal government as a powerful institution to protect their quote-unquote peculiar institution. So we see this, and we'll talk about this more in the next lecture when we discuss liberalism with a small l in terms of an important aspect of American political culture. Looking at these first 10 amendments, I think one of the things that I just wanted to get clear in regards to this is, of course, when you deal with language, you're dealing with things that and that are written down. We can see this in the realm of religion. You're dealing with interpretation, and different people have interpreted these things very, very differently. So obviously, these are the first 12 amendments. Only 10 of them were actually passed and accepted into the Constitution. So when you see Article the Third, that of course is the First Amendment, and that is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Well, what does this actually mean? How far do we take this? Freedom of speech in regards to this question. How do we understand this? This is something that the founders were concerned about. This is something we've argued about from the beginnings of the country. It's something that we have constantly been dealing with. To give a very common example here. For instance, if I ask most of my students today, do they think that freedom of speech is a positive thing and that it should be absolute, they mostly would say, yes, of course, speech should always be protected from institutional overreach of the government. Nobody should ever tell you what you can and cannot say. But of course, we understand that there are limits to this. So for instance, if somebody called in a bomb threat to a school, this would obviously be very dangerous for the people who were within the school, as perhaps it would cause a panic, but also it would be understood as being illegal speech. You cannot do it. Now, in the areas that we're talking about today, what you really get, of course, is new technologies that raise new questions in regards to these things. So speech, when the founders were talking about speech, they were thinking of speech in terms of broadsheets and of course, the press that existed at that point in time. What could they not say? Who could say it? Who could not say it? So for instance, the freedom of speech really didn't speak to everybody. It only spoke to a certain number of citizens. Obviously, if you were enslaved in the South, you did not have freedom of speech. There was no freedom of press there. So really, these were not always universal in terms of how the founders had set them up. What we get is, from this point, a growing universalism over the last 200 years that ebbs and flows with the times. The second uh, amendment is, if anything, in the last 40 years, the only one that is on the same level of controversy and argument as the first, the well-regulated militia. Again, here, the question is, what did the founders mean here? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is not a very clear statement. You see the commas here. What are we talking about? Are we talking about militia? How do we understand what they meant by the right of the people to keep and bear arms? I will say one thing, of course, as this has become a huge hot button topic in the United States, is again, new technology makes this a bigger issue. If you can the fact of everybody owning a musket that you can only get 2 to 3 rounds off in a minute says something and means something differently than being able to own an M16. Well, actually, you can't own an M16, but an M1 rifle or something like that with a bump stock, making it so that it is a automatic weapon. This means different things at different times. So these arguments point to the fact that, of course, even when you put things down in language, in written language, and you can try to make it as clear as you possibly can, you're really dealing with citizens trying to understand what the meaning of these should and should not be. Another perfect example is cruel and unusual punishment. The Bill of Rights protects against that. Well, what does that mean? It depends, of course, on the eye of the beholder. For some, cruel and unusual punishment is, at this point, putting people into solitary confinement. For the founders, this would have never been understood as being cruel and unusual punishment. They were talking about what the cruel and unusual punishment of the aristocratic world of old Europe was doing to people, breaking them on the wheel, quartering them. Obviously, again, times change. The point is, from the time of the Constitution, from the moment it is written in 1787, as it becomes the law of the land, Americans have argued about these things. They have dealt with them. They have fought for them, fought against them, discussed who it was for, who it was not for. One thing that you notice if you read the Constitution, just as a last note here, is that nowhere in the Constitution does it specify what is and what is not a citizen. Hence, this is something that Americans have been fighting about, of course, since the point in time as the American government was founded. The first definition of a citizen doesn't happen until the 14th and 15th Amendments, when it's defined what is and who is not a citizen. So almost the first 100 years of American history, there was no definitive definition of what a citizen was. Obviously, as we will see throughout this class, and as you've probably gotten a sense of, this is a central argument to American identity. Who is not an American? Is race going to matter? Is gender going to matter? Is ethnicity going to matter? Where you come from in the world? Who can come in and who cannot come in? Obviously, in terms of our world today, this is still a huge issue. The founders were dealing with it. They were talking about it, discussing it, fighting about it, and trust me, there were some nasty fights in the halls of Independence Hall as they put this thing together. So this is not anything that was going to end with 1787 and the formation of the Constitution, no matter how well it was written and how brilliant it was. We still discuss this, fight about it, argue about it, and there's no shortage of that, undoubtedly, for the future either. Okay, so that's the last of this lecture. Next, we will deal with the early political culture of the new nation.